Hey, welcome back to another He's a Porn Addict Now What the podcast. I am Joshua Shea, representing the former addict side of things. I'm with my partner, Tony Overbay, a licensed and marriage family? What is it?
That's a great question. I believe I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. Can I tell you a funny story about this?
Sure.
So I feel like, do you know the difference between psychiatrist, psychologist, and marriage and family therapist?
Being able to dispense meds.
Yeah. And it's funny because I have literally had people come to my office and say, okay, well, what prescription can you give me? And I say none. So I find it very fun to always say, yeah, a psychiatrist goes to medical school. They delivered babies during their internship, for Pete's sake. Psychologist is basically me with a PhD. So I have a master's degree in counseling and 3,000 hours of clinical experience before I take my licensing exams. So fun times. Right. Yeah. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist.
Okay.
Question 3. What do you got, Josh?
Alrighty. Question 3 is, was he this way when we first got together?
Okay.
We're talking about pornography addicts, and we're talking about their partners wondering, was he this way when we first got together? What did you say in the book, Tony?
All right. You know what? And I got to tell you, and I've enjoyed the feedback that we've received so far in this too. It is fun to go back and read this because I haven't read it in a while, and I am noticing that I would say things differently. In this one, there's a little bit of that. What I said is typically spouses ask this question because they want to know one of two things. One, how did I not see this until now? And 2, did I somehow drive him to this behavior? The first is a loaded question. If you've been together for many years, there are so many ways that you are both different from each other and so many ways in which you have both changed over the years. Is he the same person you fell in love with and married? Probably not 100%, but neither are you. And I can tell you based on seeing hundreds of individuals and sitting with them collectively for thousands of hours, that this is not an addiction that pops up overnight. However, it is an addiction that is steeped in guilt, shame, secrecy, and isolation, all of which are developed over time as the addiction progresses. If this addiction was there prior to when you met and were dating, your partner probably hoped that the sex life you would eventually share would be enough to take away any desire to view pornography or masturbate. Unfortunately, unless addicts begin doing serious recovery work, simply getting into a monogamous relationship is not enough to address the addiction. Acting out sexually, whether in a committed relationship or a one-night stand, does not satisfy the addictive nature of pornography use. So I believe that the addiction has very little to do with the spouse, although I can understand how difficult that may be for the spouse to accept. This addiction began when the husband's early exposure to pornography, to him then becoming, and I put in quotes, sexualized young, where the wiring of the brain began to view a lot of his life through a sexually charged lens. Addiction also springs from a well of unmet needs and lack of connection. He's most likely felt disconnected from his work, his schooling, his health, and his relationships, and his brain is turning to pornography whenever he's not feeling good about himself or his situation. Over time, turning to pornography has become habitual and instinctual. Sometimes I share with clients that no one typically picks up smoking in their 20s or 30s, and the concept is similar with pornography. There is early exposure that leads to an addiction of turning to porn for stress relief, to numb out, and to cope with problems. By the time an addict is married, looking at pornography is how he reacts to any and all of the above stressors. And I'll maybe comment, Josh, after your answer, just a brief thought that I have that's maybe a little bit different. I don't feel like I said anything crazy or wrong, but I have some additional thoughts. So what was your take?
Absolutely. I said to the question, was he this way when we first got together, being the former pornography addict? I said, depending on how long you've been together, your husband either was already there or the pieces were in place and the tendency just hadn't blossomed into something terrible yet. I maintained my addiction for over 20 years without recognizing it could be classified as such. Once it was brought to my attention, it still took 6 months and hundreds of hours of therapy before I was willing to truly accept it. Reading between the lines, you could be asking the question, is this my fault? The answer, even if he'd never seen porn before meeting you, which is unlikely in 99.99999% of cases, is that none of this is your fault. This isn't a blame situation for you or him. If he's an addict, it means he's sick. He doesn't have to come to terms with it to actually be sick. Just because I came to accept my porn addiction as a mental illness does not mean it began at that moment of revelation. It means I saw it was there with clear understanding for the very first time. Denial or acceptance has very little to do with this condition. I've seen statistics that say 90 to 95% of people with sexually focused addiction issues have some kind of trauma from abuse that took place earlier in life. It doesn't have to be sexual in nature, but it often is. I was not in the critical stage of pornography addiction when I first met my wife in 2002. I had long been in the ongoing stage where usage would cyclically spike and wane for at least a decade by that point. I don't think I reached the critical phase when things started going off the rails until 2013. Were all the pieces there when I met her? Probably, but like a stew, they needed to be mixed and boiled to the proper temperature. I think we're all capable of a lot of negative things that never quite reach the breaking point. Looking at it objectively, I can't point a finger at her for any of it. These were my issues. She is to be commended for keeping the family together, not just during the first 11 years of marriage before I entered recovery, but also even today for shepherding her flock through those years when I was at inpatient rehab or doing jail time. Life is probably as easy for us as it ever has been right now, but through it all, none of my addiction issues had anything to do with her. He probably was that way when you got together. It's just that other influences have let it get out of hand. You didn't cause any of this, even if he claims the exact opposite.
Okay, I so appreciate that because I feel like a lot of the women that come into my office, and I know you're certified in betrayal trauma, helping women with betrayal trauma. How often do you feel like you do hear that from the wife where I must play a role? There's a reason. There's something about this is about me.
Yeah, almost every time.
Yeah.
Because I think that partners are looking for answers where they can help solve them. And if the answer is just, you're not pretty enough, you don't have enough sex, you need to treat him X, Y, or Z differently. It's hard to hear that you didn't cause it and you can't do anything about it. But sadly, that's the situation most find themselves in. And it's tough saying you can create boundaries, you can lean on him. And I know we'll get into that in future questions. But I think that question is asked because it would allow them to take ownership. And if they have some ownership, they can fix things.
Okay, I love that you're saying that. And I think part of what I was going to add, which I think it fits perfectly, is there's two things. I think one is you don't know what you don't know. And so when someone grew up, and I put in there when I was talking about the quotes of sexualized, is that when I first started doing this work, I don't know, nearly 20 years ago, the assumption was if somebody was addicted to pornography or a sex addict, that there must have been sexual molestation early or that sort of thing. And I know you know this, but the earlier we get exposure to pornography, which is happening earlier and earlier because of the availability, is that now we deem that in that same group of being sexualized. I always give this example of if you grew up and you had seen porn, now all of a sudden your second or third grade teacher is a female with shapes and parts and that sort of thing. And if you're sitting beside the kid where back in the day when their dad had to first of all have the magazines that you had to know where they were to go find them. But if you didn't grow up with that, she was just Mrs. Johnson, your third grade teacher. So you got two kids having a completely different experience. And I think when you look at it that way, sexualization doesn't have to have come from the sexual trauma, but it can be sexualized. I don't know. Was that your experience at all, the early sexualization?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think my sexualization came, I wish it was 11 or 12 years old. I think mine came at 5, 6 years old.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what did cause me to seek out things in the 80s that weren't easily available. You know, I had to figure out how to get magazines. I had to figure out how to get videotapes because we didn't have the access to the internet at that time. But yeah, absolutely. I was sexualized early, and I can't remember a time where I didn't look at women when I was that young and consider them to be body parts. And the average kid now on my TikTok account, obviously unscientific, but I once asked, were you 11 or below or 12 and over when you first saw porn? And I think it was like 49-51%, or 50-50%. It was so close. And this was with several thousands of people voting.
Yeah.
And so at least among the young TikTok demographic, The average age seems to be about 11, 12 years old that somebody really sees porn for the first time. And most kids haven't hit puberty at that point. Most
Exactly.
kids are not thinking in those terms. And that absolutely would change your complete outlook, your complete life. I have had many clients talk about when they finally learned how to masturbate from a cousin or a friend, or
Yeah.
somebody taught them when they were like 12 years old. And they make jokes, but it's like overnight, their life changes, their
Overnight.
worldview changes, their relationships with the opposite sex change. It's a switch that gets flipped.
Yeah.
And
And
it's not a switch that should get flipped for a long time.
right, right. And it's interesting. I like that you have the anecdotal data, because I actually do feel like the real data that I've read is the average age now first exposure is between 8 and 11 is what the info shares. So it backs up what you're seeing. And it's far too young. It really is, because that's when those things happen pre-puberty. But there's a pretty strong belief that then almost like whatever you take into puberty, it kind of becomes intensified. And somebody's just having a boyish, innocent move into puberty, this slow transition, that then they may have a healthier relationship with, this is something I can do on occasion. But if it became that hyper focus before, well, it can become an addiction or an obsession.
Absolutely. And I think that for the partner listening to us, finding out when their partner, and in this case, the husband or the boyfriend, when they first saw pornography, when they first were around naked people, that's probably going to inform you a lot about what his addiction is, where it came from. If he talks about finding dad's Playboys when he was 7, 8 years old, that's a lot different than finding dad's Playboys when you're 14 or 15.
It really is. And it's funny because I will speak to that. I mean, growing up in the 80s when I did, I've made jokes about this, but that was all that I knew of or had access to, was the secret stash under the bathroom counter that could only be accessed if they went away for the weekend. And even then we had to exact it like a skilled surgeon, with the belief that he would notice, oh my gosh, it's 1 degree off from where it was, which is hilarious to think about. And that wasn't even done for me till I was in my teenage years. So then it was this occasional thing when the opportunity presented. So it was much more casual relationship with pornography than what would be the case today. I can't imagine what access is like today for a kid. It would.
No, I think to put a button on this, it's important to reiterate, it is not your fault. It's not your fault whatsoever. It's like if you moved in with a guy and you moved in during the winter time and you looked outside and there was nothing there, and then come springtime, early summer, oh, he has a garden. Oh, things are growing in it. You didn't plant those seeds. He did. He planted them before you ever got there. And it just came time now that you're seeing that that his addiction has grown inside of him, and he can't hide that from you anymore. So that garden of his pornography addiction, it bloomed without you. Those seeds were in the ground well before you ever got there.
Yeah, no, that makes so much sense. Josh, kind of exciting things now because of the feedback that we've been receiving on those just already in the first 2 episodes. And I think we alluded to this a little bit last time, but we have so much more to say on this. Even the things that we just talked about, I would love to go into a little bit more detail around. I talk about in that answer of this chapter, these what I call voids in people's lives. I really feel like pornography is a coping mechanism when people don't feel connected in certain areas of their life. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a bonus episode. And that is going to be for our newly welcome paid subscribers. So we're going to have all that information in the show notes. Go look at that right now. And we would love to have you join us on a bonus episode where we're going to go into more detail on this answer and kind of give our thoughts on what maybe we have, if we have any change of philosophy since the time we wrote the book. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail of things that hopefully will help you if you're on the journey of trying to recover or overcome pornography addiction, if you're the betrayed spouse, or even I want to speak to the clinicians. We've gotten so much good feedback from therapists who have bought the book as well. So we're going to hit all of that in the bonus material. So I hope that we will see you there in just a minute. Go right over to it right now. Josh, thanks again. I'll see you on episode 4. We'll catch you over in the bonus side.